I was 9 years old when Lydia first arrived at our doorstep. The memory of her wide hazel eyes, wearing an oversized pink cardigan, and clutching a stuffed lion remains vivid in my mind even now. My parents introduced her as our new family member, the sweet child they had adopted after a long process of applications and waiting. At first, I was excited at the prospect of having a younger sister. I had no illusions of wanting to share my toys, but I did imagine we'd bond over bedtime stories and maybe even become best friends. However, it soon became apparent that my parents looked at Lydia as if she was the second coming of some saintly being. Even her slightest achievements, like coloring within the lines or memorizing a nursery rhyme, were treated as a grand accomplishment. Meanwhile, I was expected to continue my chores, excel in my schoolwork, and remain grateful simply for having her around. I wasn't quite sure what to think of the attention she was getting, but I knew I resented it. I found myself perpetually stuck in the background, my accomplishments overshadowed by Lydia's presence. That was only the beginning of the wedge that formed between me and my family. As the years passed, the favoritism became more blatant. Mom would rush to Lydia's side when she scraped her knee, cooing over her like she was made of delicate porcelain. Dad would beam with pride whenever Lydia learned something new, no matter how trivial it might seem. I can't recall a single instance in which my parents applauded anything I did with that same level of enthusiasm. There were times I'd bring home perfect test scores, and they'd just nod absent-mindedly before reminding me to help Lydia with her homework. Not once did they say, "We're proud of you," or even ask if I needed support or encouragement. Meanwhile, Lydia basked in their devotion. She was handed this golden ticket of unconditional love, while I was relegated to the role of the older sibling, expected to be self-sufficient. Over time, my resentment grew like a fungus, clinging to every bit of my psyche, feeding on every perceived injustice until I was thoroughly consumed by bitterness. Still, I managed to keep it under control, telling myself maybe it was all in my head, that soon I'd do something noteworthy enough to be seen. But that day never arrived. If anything, it got worse once Lydia entered high school. My parents paid for private tutors to guarantee that her grades never dipped below an A-. They bought her a car on her 16th birthday, something I had to earn by working weekends at a local diner. I spent nights seething in silent fury, listening to Lydia brag about how she only had to ask Dad for gas money, while I had to bust tables and mop floors to fill my tank. Perhaps my parents thought they were making up for lost time because Lydia had spent the first few years of her life without them. Or maybe they were simply that smitten with her. Whatever the reason, it stung. I felt like an afterthought, a footnote in the family's story. It was no wonder I moved out at 18, eager to put distance between myself and a house that no longer felt like home. I told myself that once I was on my own, I'd build a life so successful my parents would have no choice but to notice me. Over the next few years, I worked my way up from a string of menial jobs to more stable employment, eventually saving enough to open a small boutique in my hometown. It wasn't an overnight success by any means. I fought tooth and nail for a business loan, rewrote my plan a dozen times, and lost countless nights of sleep worrying about rent, inventory, and advertising. But each step forward felt like a personal triumph. From securing the perfect downtown location to picking out a distinctive decor that matched my vision, I poured my heart into every decision. Occasionally, I'd share updates with my parents, but those conversations always detoured back to Lydia. It became routine. "How's the business?" Swiftly followed by, "Lydia made the dean's list again." Eventually, I stopped expecting any interest from them, focusing instead on my goals. Then, just as I was finalizing the plans for my store's grand opening, my parents made a demand that shattered any illusion of independence I'd built. They insisted I share my big day with Lydia's graduation celebration, merging the two events into one family affair. In that moment, all the resentment I'd been suppressing swelled to the surface. I remember that phone call as if it happened minutes ago. My mother's voice was coated in false sweetness. She declared that relatives from out of town would be around for Lydia's graduation, so wouldn't it be wonderful to hold both celebrations together? She spoke like it was the most logical idea ever, ignoring all the meticulous work I had put into planning my boutique's debut. Dad chimed in, suggesting it would bring extra foot traffic and benefit me. I could practically hear Lydia's smug grin in the background, sensing how thrilled she was to overshadow yet another accomplishment of mine. My immediate reaction was molten anger. I wanted to yell that my boutique opening was personal, a testament to my hard work. Instead, I swallowed that rage. My parents were so used to me complying with their demands that they probably didn't anticipate any pushback. But in that moment, something snapped inside me. I told them, through gritted teeth, that I would agree. Beneath my shaky composure, I promised myself it would be the last time they disrespected me. If they wanted me to share my greatest achievement with Lydia's celebration, I would give them a spectacle they'd never forget. The days leading up to that joint event were frenzied. I had to ensure the boutique looked perfect. Fresh paint, enticing displays, a welcoming ambience. My parents, on the other hand, were only interested in the social aspects. Which caterer to hire, the schedule of toasts, even wanting Lydia's graduation photos projected on a screen in my store. I nodded along, outwardly cooperative, all the while seething inside. I had no fully formed plan at first, only a raw determination to sabotage their self-serving gathering. Over the years, the bitterness I'd felt had become a hardened shell of resolve. I vowed that I would turn their grand spectacle into a disaster. Time flew, and the tension within me grew taut, like a spring ready to snap. On the morning of the combined event, I felt strangely calm, the kind of eerie composure that comes from absolute conviction. That morning, sunlight illuminated the new sign bearing my name on the storefront. I unlocked the doors to my shop and breathed in the faint scent of fresh paint, savoring that moment of quiet triumph. But reality struck when my parents showed up a couple of hours later with Lydia in tow. She wore her graduation gown, bright eyes scanning the interior as Mom and Dad set up a small shrine to her accomplishments. Trophies, certificates, photos, the works. Relatives arrived soon after, all cooing over Lydia. "We're so proud of you," Aunt Diane told her. Grandpa patted Lydia's shoulder, reminding everyone that this was her day. It didn't matter that we were in my store, celebrating my grand opening. I stood among my own merchandise and felt like an intruder. My resentment solidified, and I silently triggered the first steps of my revenge. No turning back now. I was finished being the backdrop in my own story. In the opening hours, everything went according to my parents' plan. Guests floated through the boutique, sipping champagne, sampling hors d'oeuvres, and congratulating Lydia on her graduation. I greeted them with forced politeness. My parents gave a short speech, boasting about Lydia's bright future, and, almost as an afterthought, thanking me for letting them use my store. A few of my extended family cast disinterested glances, as if my boutique was some whimsical hobby overshadowed by Lydia's real achievement. Then came my turn to speak. With the microphone in hand, I offered typical pleasantries, thanking everyone for coming and congratulating Lydia on her milestones. Polite applause followed, and my parents seemed visibly relieved, likely convinced I was resigned to the role of gracious sibling. They had no clue what I had prepared next. My pulse hammered, but I kept my composure. Something in me thrilled at the imminent chaos I was about to unleash. I had spent a small fortune hiring a private investigator to dig into Lydia's past, as well as my parents' finances tied to her adoption. I needed anything, any revelation that might rock their perfect golden child image. The results were astounding. My parents had diverted substantial funds for Lydia from the moment she arrived. They paid for everything: private tutors, her lavish college dorm, car, living expenses, while giving me next to nothing. Even that alone was enough to incite rage, but what the investigator found next was even more scandalous. Lydia's birth mother was alive and residing just a few towns over. Some correspondents suggested she'd attempted to contact my parents, but they slammed the door, not wanting to tarnish their precious family narrative. I didn't know how Lydia would react, but the knowledge that she'd been kept from her birth mother to preserve my parents' illusions left me incandescent with anger. I knew these revelations could blow the family sky high, and that was precisely what I intended to do. While the party bustled on, I discreetly signaled my friend, who stood by the audio-visual controls I'd installed around the boutique. The screens, which until then had displayed a rotating gallery of Lydia's graduation photos, began showing something else entirely. At first, it looked like more photos of Lydia in her cap and gown, but then came scanned documents, bank statements that proved the thousands of dollars invested in Lydia's upbringing, followed by excerpts of the adoption papers and hints about her birth mother. The crowd's cheerful chatter died away. Confusion rippled among the guests, replaced by shocked murmurs. My parents went sheet white. They lunged for the screens, frantically trying to turn them off. But my friend had locked the system with a password, and we had multiple devices streaming the same content. One by one, every screen in the store displayed the truth. The hidden accounts, the repeated payments, the hush money sent to keep Lydia's birth mother silent. My mother's eyes widened in panic. Dad cursed under his breath, yanking cables from the nearest monitor, only to see the same footage appear elsewhere. Lydia herself stared at the screen, questions forming in her eyes. She looked to my parents, but they were too busy trying to contain the disaster. The boutique exploded with scandalized shrieks and outraged whispers. Relatives demanded to know why my parents had deceived everyone. Some tried to pull Lydia aside, shielding her from the fallout. I had a fleeting pang of empathy for Lydia. She had no clue. But that sympathy evaporated as I remembered all my overlooked accomplishments, every memory of her soaking up our parents' praise. My father spun around to face me, barking at me to shut it down. I feigned ignorance, saying I had no idea how. I made sure I still gripped the microphone so everyone would hear. "Maybe you should have asked me for help before," I said, letting my voice ring with years of pent-up frustration. Mom stood by, tears welling, torn between comforting Lydia and appeasing the scandalized relatives. Lydia trembled, tears sliding down her cheeks, clearly unable to process that her entire life had been a meticulously choreographed lie. For once, I didn't rush to her side to offer condolences. She would feel exactly what I had felt for so long, betrayed, sidelined, and stripped of any illusions about this family's so-called fairness. My father finally managed to corner me amidst the chaos. "How could you do this?" he hissed, jabbing a finger at Lydia, who was now being consoled by a pair of aunts. He demanded that I apologize, demanded that I tell everyone it was a mistake. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that seemed to echo in the tense air. This was the first time I ever saw genuine fear in his eyes, as if he truly realized his grip on the family was fracturing. My mother stumbled over, tears streaming down her face. She tried to play the guilt card, whispering that they had raised me, that they did their best. But I refused to budge. "For Lydia, yes," I shot back. "Not for me." I walked away before they could respond, leaving them amid the wreckage of their pristine facade. My heart pounded with a twisted satisfaction. This was retribution, a statement of my worth, and I felt no twinge of remorse. Any semblance of a party dissolved after that. Most guests left in a rush, scandalized and unsure what to say. Lydia's eyes were stained with mascara tears, and my parents hovered near her like broken sentinels, caught between shame and desperation. Meanwhile, I watched them from behind the register, the sign bearing my name glinting beneath the store's lights. My father fumed about cutting me out of the family, about how he'd never forgive me for airing their dirty laundry. My mother shot daggers at me with her glare. Lydia stared numbly, perhaps finally realizing she had never really understood the depth of the resentment brewing within me. I continued standing, arms folded, unmoving. My own family had turned me into a resentful stranger, and I was done waiting for them to change. When the last relative vacated the store, I closed the door, exhaling. The store was an absolute mess. Half-eaten food, toppled decorations, and a cluster of phones buzzing with frantic messages. Yet, I felt oddly at peace, as though a crushing weight had been lifted from my shoulders. In the days that followed, the fallout was massive. My parents bombarded my phone with voicemails, some laced with rage, others with pleas for an explanation. I ignored them. Lydia sent lengthy emails explaining she had never asked for special treatment, that she felt blindsided and betrayed by my actions. She wanted me to talk to her, to at least tell her why I hadn't warned her. But I felt no compulsion to comfort her, offer closure, or help her make sense of it. She may not have orchestrated my parents' favoritism, but she undeniably profited from it for years without so much as a second thought about how it affected me. Let them live with confusion for once. Meanwhile, our extended family was aflutter with rumor and speculation. A few relatives sided with me, saying it was high time my parents answered for their injustices. Others condemned my actions as cruel and tactless. My boutique, the scene of the scandal, became a minor curiosity in town. Some boycotted it, calling me vindictive. Others showed up out of sheer nosiness. I welcomed them, keeping my tone polite and professional, determined to let my business's quality speak for itself. And life, of course, kept moving. About a month later, a local reporter caught wind of the debacle and dug further into Lydia's adoption story, culminating in a shocking article that exposed my parents' secret payments to Lydia's birth mother to keep her distant. The piece cast Lydia as a tragic figure, manipulated by my parents' determination to maintain control. At the same time, I was depicted as the merciless instigator who hijacked a celebratory moment to deliver a very public punishment. In truth, that portrayal didn't bother me. I'd expected backlash, and I didn't lose any sleep over it. My store's reputation took a temporary hit, but eventually sales stabilized. My parents, humiliated, withdrew from almost every social circle. My mother quit attending church gatherings, and my father refused to speak to any reporters. Lydia, from what I heard, left town sooner than she'd planned, possibly to meet her birth mother. I imagined her awkward first meeting, confronting the truth her adoptive parents had hidden for so long. A part of me wondered if she would seek my sympathy or blame me for setting the wheels in motion. Either way, I felt no obligation to step in. I won't pretend there weren't moments when I questioned myself. Late at night, alone in my cramped apartment above the boutique, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if my revenge had been too vicious. A pang of guilt occasionally surfaced, especially when I recalled Lydia's stricken face as she realized her life's narrative had been built on secrets. But I quickly pushed that guilt aside by remembering every time my parents had minimized my efforts and showered Lydia with attention I'd never known. My bitterness was a shield, a well of anger that protected me from regret. If I had the chance to go back, would I do it again? The honest answer was yes. Years of neglect had led to this moment, and I felt my parents needed to face the price of their choices. Forgiveness was never on the table. They wanted to merge my opening day with Lydia's graduation and treat it like an afterthought. They assumed I'd remain compliant, invisible, so I gave them a finale befitting all the hurt they had inflicted. 2 months later, I encountered my mother in the grocery store. She looked worn, with bags under her eyes and hair that had lost its usual polished sheen. She tried to say something, perhaps searching for a truce or an explanation. I gazed at her calmly, waiting to see if she would even acknowledge the root of our estrangement. All she offered was a trembling, "We never wanted this to happen." I said nothing. I picked up my items and walked away, leaving her standing by the produce aisle, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. I refused to give her the solace of an apology or an admission of guilt. In my mind, we were beyond mending. They had actively, knowingly favored Lydia for years, and they never once admitted they were wrong until everything had imploded in public. Let them live with that. News trickled in that Lydia was indeed meeting her birth mother. Whether they established any bond, I didn't know. The part of me that had once been curious was now buried under layers of anger and self-preservation. I had no interest in bridging that gap, not now. My time was spent focusing on building a loyal customer base at my boutique, creating new marketing strategies, and forging connections unrelated to my family. In some ways, it was lonely. I had shut out my parents, held Lydia at arm's length, and alienated certain relatives who called me heartless. But for me, it was preferable to being that silent, overshadowed child again. Seasons changed, and I kept forging ahead. I expanded my boutique's offerings, partnered with local artisans, and started hosting small community events. Bit by bit, I carved out a name for myself that had nothing to do with Lydia or my parents. The scandal, while fresh in some people's memories, gradually faded in the swirl of everyday life. New controversies took the spotlight, and my parents' misdeeds became old gossip. Lydia remained absent, presumably carrying on with her future wherever she landed. Mom and Dad never attempted another grand reconciliation, likely having grasped that I wasn't going to yield. They had learned, too late, that I was no longer content to be an afterthought.